Unit 2, Lesson 2, Practicing the Story. Western culture was built upon and created wealth from slavery. I am not intending to engage in ideological warfare, I'm only stating a historical fact. Our entire way of life, military, academics, politics, and religion, relies on a system of knowing who is master over whom, and who has control and authority in any situation. Our Western way of life can be argued as evil or not, because it has led to safety, prosperity, and stability for millions of human beings. But the way it established itself, through the enslavement and dehumanization of a specific segment of the population, is evil. We see the repercussions of this in many ways, but for this unit we will discuss how it has informed gaming culture to create an environment prone to toxicity and supremacy. Quote, master is, quote, one having authority over another. Our society is a very carefully balanced system of masters and subordinates. This makes the term dungeon master or game master tricky. It is impossible in a system built upon masters and slaves to separate the connotation from the word. But we want our games to be places of inclusion, collegiality, and mutual respect. When we play with a master mentality, a position in which one person has authority over the players, and therefore their stories, we do not allow for brave space, agency, or personal formation. The steward ideology is one in which a person dedicates a significant part of their time to create a world with history, depth, and factions with agendas that players influence through their causal agency. The steward responds to players' affectance in ways that make sense to the natural world and the factions within it. The steward does not contrive an endgame scenario and then force players into it one way or another. Stewards want a table of equals working together to bring something that responds to their inner need and outward expressions of personal identity to life. But how? A framework for brave space. Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, PBIS, is an evidence-based tiered framework. This system utilizes 5 focus areas to create environments that support behavioral, academic, social, emotional, and mental health. PBIS translates easily into a gaming environment and can lead to profoundly positive experiences for players and stewards of the game. Here are steps you can practice. 1. Equity. Stewards have conversations with players before game sessions to identify valuable outcomes and prioritize them for the group. The steward is the central catalyst for this conversation and is the only one who can have it. This also means the steward must be committed to adapting to the player's needs. If one person has a trigger that is dangerous to their physical and/or emotional safety, then no one should experience that trigger. The steward cannot create an environment best suited for everyone to succeed without first identifying the needs of their players and choosing practices that attempt to meet those needs. Questions stewards can ask that build equity are: can you tell me 5 words that describe your world right now so I can get an idea of what you bring to my table? Or, are there any triggers I should be aware of that we must avoid? In roleplay, we sometimes go to weird, vulnerable places, and I want to safeguard your safety. 2. Systems. The Eldsmith gaming system is a rules-light methodology that supports both the steward of the game and the players in it. This system supports the story first and is built upon a character's influence on the story and a player's causal agency. In Eldsmith, the rules reflect real life and encourage mutual support, respect, individuality, and inclusion. You cannot safeguard brave space without using a system to govern and uphold community norms as practices of mutuality and inclusion. 3. Data. As a steward manages a story through play, they are encouraged to collect feedback from players constantly. One method of doing this is what we have called a divinity system, wherein players suggest alternatives, corrections, or ideas about the meta-narrative to the steward at the end of each session. The players decide which idea to present as their primary ideation, and then the steward responds in realistic ways within the story. This is intended to be a cooperative and collaborative experience. Touching base with individual players during breaks or after sessions by text message is invaluable and necessary. You cannot make informed decisions about the progress of your gaming community without practicing data collection. Some example questions are: what is an aspect of the story that we are not focusing on that we should? Or, what needs to happen to make this story more profound to you? 4. Practices. The units in this training process all have practices included for you to incorporate or not into your games. Theology, safeguarding, psychology, pastoring, communal storytelling, game mechanics, and improvisation are all aspects that may or may not address the needs of your players. How does including or altering these practices benefit your players' behavioral, academic, social, emotional, and mental health? 5. Outcomes. Establishing equity among players required identifying goals and needs. Meeting these needs requires the direct questioning of a player's satisfaction with the game. As a steward, it is helpful to connect with players to evaluate your work through the game and interpersonal behavior so that you can grow and improve as a steward of the community story. To measure outcomes, a steward must first know what is important to the community. These questions are a good starting point to build outcomes-based goals for managing your game community. Examples of feedback are, how can I as a player make different choices for the positive effect of my team? Or, what feedback would benefit how my team is playing? Or, what feedback does my steward need to hear? Feed forward examples would be, what improves our story in the next session? What rabbit hole, side quest, or secret mission did we miss that we should return to? Brave Space is the result of working through the PBIS framework. Both players and stewards practice vulnerability and expressing their needs to create equity at their table. The Eldsmith system changes the perspective of the game and pushes us out of our comfort zones into spaces of communal storytelling. Data collection regularly in-game helps us face unspoken fears and concerns about the story and what it triggers within us. Practices provide strategies for confronting those fears in healthy ways that encourage positive growth. Feed forward and communal feedback allows each player to examine their intentions for positive effect and voice negative emotions that may undermine the overall health and well-being of the group, restarting the framework at stage 1 by collecting more data. Positive behavioral effect in the sandbox. We can repeat the steps of the positive behavioral framework when we build our sandbox in which players will play and explore. As discussed in the previous lesson, communal storytelling is about empowerment and relaxed control of the meta-narrative. Quote, sandbox is a term used metaphorically to describe the style of play in video, board, and role-playing games. It generally means a game that leans heavily into undirected free play. There are mini-games, such as exploration, puzzles, or conflict scenarios, but the players are free to engage in mini-games at their discretion and schedule. Using the positive behavioral framework, we will plan an example sandbox episode for 3 players. Step 1. Equity. Equity requires data collection before sitting down at the table, or at the outset of the game session if the steward is confident enough to build a sandbox spontaneously. The goal of creating equity is the same as it is before the team comes together to play. Identify valuable outcomes and prioritize them for the group. This can be as simple as asking players, what do we want to play today? Type of mission coincides with the playstyle for each player. For example, Old McGregory has asked some stupid fools, intrepid adventurers, to hunt the monster eating his chickens. This would be a tracking and solving a puzzle of a monster hunt. Or, the prior of the monastery has requested support in exploring an ancient cave system for relics of a long-lost colony of monks from before the breaking. This is exploring ancient dungeons, filled with traps and danger, like a tomb raid. The sheriff needs to deputize some citizens to address the Goonberry gang who have been harassing and robbing the king's supply lines in the Shadow Woods. This uses skill and stealth to solve a problem with tactical combat missions. The wizard magicus has a list of components necessary to construct a cognition spell for the prince, who hasn't been, quote, in his right head since he was thrown from his horse last Tuesday. This is a Minecraft resource development tree and a quest for the MacGuffin. The mayor has asked us to search the depths of the Shadow Woods for the last location of a starfighter that has crashed in a planetary bombardment last winter. This is a hex crawl through the wilderness. Once the steward knows their players, generating gameplay equity is easier through missions instead of crafting a meta-narrative. A valuable outcome of the group is based on their playstyles and engagement with the narrative and becomes more easily attainable over time. This is the primary reason for the weekend game retreat, which allows us to craft equity more completely for our players. Systems. In a sandbox, your systems are your mini-games. Tabletop, board, and video games all have mini-games. When building the sandbox, partner playstyle and valuable outcomes to a mission, then pair it with the appropriate mini-game. Some examples of mini-games are tactical combat. minis on a map with special abilities and lots of dice rolls. Roleplay. Players take on character personas to talk through social, ethical, problem solving, or scenario based challenges. Puzzles. I am a fan of the escape room puzzle chain, in which one puzzle unlocks the possible solution to the next. Another favorite is the open-ended puzzle, which presents a non-linear situation and encourages players to develop the most creative solution possible. Obstacle course. A preset path of obstacles that players use character skills and abilities to navigate, which can include any other minigame asset. Exploration. Reveal the map or the wilderness through careful description and representation. Crafting. Searching for recipes, acquiring components, and building new assets that open up new storylines or abilities. You can engage your player's equity through myriad minigame systems. Data. The narrative crafted by the steward becomes the background data players use to form a meta-narrative. This is the, quote, story of the world, and is the primary difference between railroaded narratives and communal storytelling. When your meta-narrative happens independently of causative agency, it makes room for the players to engage, or not, as they decide, which means you, as the steward, are responsible to their effectance, not trying to get them to a specific goal. Here's how you do that, using some simple world building as an example. Our game has 3 players, each with a different playstyle. Player 1 loves combat and rolling dice. Player 2 loves the story and role-playing emotional situations that feel important or have depth of meaning. Player 3 is all about being with their friends and joking around while building rapport outside the game. Step 1, we identify the factions in our world. There's a marauding tribe of orcs that has terrorized the people for generations. No one knows the source of their animosity, but there has been war for decades. This would be Player 1's affinity for combat. The townsfolk are connected to the land with nature magic, but even that can't heal the children, all of whom have recently fallen ill with a mysterious illness that no medicine has cured. This affects Player 2 with their emotional contact. A magical creature came to one of your players in a dream. This creature represents the Golem, a race of beings hidden deep in the swamps that need understanding adventurers to confront an ancient evil they are no longer strong enough to contain. This is given to player 3 independently so that they can convince the group or not to engage the hook. Step 2, we develop the narrative of our factions over chapters. In our case, we'll be playing for the weekend and have 5 sessions that are 2 hours long. For the sake of clarity, I'm developing only one faction's narrative here, the Orc tribe. Remember, each session's narrative will happen whether players do anything about it or not. As players play and make choices, their effectance can alter these checkpoints, which the steward adjusts in between sessions. The example of the Orc narrative. In Session 1, the Orcs raid the McGregory farmstead and take the family hostage. They do this to gain information about the town and recent events that their shaman has dreamed of. In Session 2, if left unchecked, the Orcs learn from McGregory that the townsfolk dug a new well and found a cave under the town filled with crystals. The Orcs have a prophecy about the crystals being the key to their peace and prosperity, so they send stealth agents into town to investigate. Unfortunately, the agents are found and have to fight their way free, causing havoc in the process. In Session 3, the Orcs, who are desperate to be free of the oppression of the dragon that tormented them for generations, they agree to invade the town and steal the crystals and use their magic to confront the dragon. If they have to kill the townsfolk, so be it. The townsfolk have not negotiated before, why would they start now? In Session 4, having secured the crystals by any means, the Orcs spend this session searching for materials to turn the crystals into magical weapons. They raid local areas of interest and take what cannot be bought or given. They are desperate to be free of the dragon. In Session 5, armed with their magical weapons, the Orcs confront the adult blue dragon in the mountains near their village. Win or lose, they will be free of its tyranny. After we develop the narrative of our factions, we present our players with mission hooks that are based on their playstyle that may have an effect on these world's factions and their independent narratives. For instance, the McGregory farmstead has been raided by orcs, and they were taken hostage. You have to free them at any cost. Kill the orcs if you have to. The healer Madge needs help. Interview and explore the village for any way to identify the secret illness affecting our children. Or you have a dream in which Funk Willie the Golem leads you to a secret door that holds an ancient treasure. This drawing is your best recollection of that door. Maybe it holds a clue as to how to find Funk Willie. And the last step is, as players make choices, edit the faction narratives between sessions in response to the effectance of player choice. This helps players know their choices have meaning and affect the larger world. Practices. This is how we practice the story. The definition of practice is, quote, to perform an activity or exercise, a skill, repeatedly or regularly to improve or maintain one's proficiency. We improve the story through our choices and based on our inherent psychology, behavior, and how we develop our characters. There is no pre-written story that players strive to uncover because we write it together. This leads to less decision fatigue by the steward. This eliminates any conflict between the quote master of the story and their subordinates because equity and data are the foundations of the narrative rather than supremacy. Finally, outcomes. At the end of every session, ask your players, what do you want to do next session? Listen to their conversation about direction and decision making, then prepare your next session based directly on the valuable outcomes and needs expressed by players this session. As an outcomes-focused catalyst, the steward's role becomes that of designer and artist, or mechanic, or engineer, depending on your skill set. The steward is the catalyst of the story, empowering players to write the history of their characters, creating an environment of communal storytelling instead of egoistic railroading, in which fun is determined by how well the master creates exciting play for their people.